acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty, No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Good evening. I'm Brian Moore, a volunteer for the Brant Historical Society. For the past 10 years, I've offered a series of walking tours of various parts of Brantford and Brant County. Several people, especially those who can't join me for my walks, have asked if I would provide a presentation of the content of some of the walks. Tonight is my first attempt with a new medium, limited not by the content, but by the suitable photographs. Just an aside, I do have a set of 7 walks scheduled for the spring, all being well. Maybe you want to go to the Brant Historical Society website and see whether there's any of the walks you'd like to participate in. I'm in costume today, typical of the 1830s and 40s. There was an economic depression in the UK, and a black outer clothing became the style for most people, and most style was done enhanced by either the neckwear or waistcoat. To learn a little bit more about the fashions of the settlers, join us next month when Esther Brower will talk about the attire before, in other words, during the Georgian period up to 1830. Much of the information is resourced from newspaper articles authored by Jean Waldy and presented by the Brant Historical Society in a two-volume set of books that were produced some time ago, titled Brant County, The Story of Its People. So that's the reference with which I'm working. What makes this place? Franciscan Recollet priest, Father Joseph de la Roche Delon, described the Grand River Valley as the most beautiful he had seen in all his wanderings through New France. Itinerant Presbyterian minister Reverend William Proudfoot in 1832 described Upper Canada thus: "I do not know if I shall be able to convey to you an idea of the appearance of this country. It may be said to be a vast flat land, at least it has nothing in the whole extent of it that can be called a mountain, scarcely anything that can be called a hill. There are slight undulations which, were the land cleared, would diversify the surface country, but covered as the whole land is with wood, there is scarcely any eminence from which a person can see any distance." In 1805, John Stotts or Staltz, I suspect it's probably Stotts because there isn't a Staltz in the old world, believed to be of mixed background, built the first cabin, a log hut, near the ford. The Six Nations of the Grand had already settled in the Grand River Valley for more than a generation, but they had chosen to settle at various locations along the river, with the nearest being the Mohawk village, further downstream, where the Mohawk Chapel is situated. There were about 700 Indigenous people living in this area, farming the land. In 1807, Enos Bunnell built a second cabin near the ford, despite this being defined as native territory on all of the maps. He and his cabin would remain there for many years. An inn would be built on the site in later years. In fact, there was soon an inn on both sides of the ford where people could wait to catch a ferry to cross the river above the ford or wait across the fording place when the river was not flowing too fast. An early focus at the ford um, at the fording place was trade with the indigenous people. There was a wooden bridge built across the river in 1812, but early use resulted in the bridge collapsing. After the War of 1812, another wood bridge was built, and it survived until being swept away by a spring flood. In 1818, there was a total of 12 people living at the ford. The families having land on either side of the ford were Chief David Hill and later his son Henry Aaron, who held the land that would become the village. The sons of Joseph Brant, John and Jacob, held land on the west side of the ford, and Joseph Brant's widow, Mary, held land in the area we know as Eastward. What's in a name? The fording place, Mississauga Hill, Grand River Ferry were just some of the early names for the locality. It was soon being called the Grand River Swamp because of the marshy area that developed in the shallows behind the ford, which grew larger with the various dams built on the river, as well as other swampy areas that already resulted from the cold water streams that flowed through the floodplain. In 1827, Bigger, believed to be Robert from the map of 1830, who lived near Mount Pleasant, owned a great deal of land around the ferry near the fording place, as well as the bridge that crossed the ford. He sponsored the bridge construction and collected tolls, and it became known as Bigger's Bridge. Therefore, Bigger wanted the settlement that was starting to be named Biggerstown. Captain Marshall Lewis was the contractor who had built the bridge for Bigger, and he also owned a mill close to the ford next to Water Street between Mill and Market Streets. It's not pictured, that's actually the Kirby mill that was built much later. Lewis suggested the village should be named Louisville because of the importance of his mill to any new village. John Aston Wilkes, who was a major businessman in this small town and who had purchased extensive land lots in anticipation of the expanding village, wanted the village to be named after his birthplace in England, Birmingham. Someone whose name was never recorded suggested that in honor of the famous leader who had brought his Six Nation loyalists north to this area, the village should be called Brantford. The name Brantford was approved quickly by the roomful of citizens at the meeting, there to discuss the name. And it was not long before the name was shortened to Brantford. Those who came from away. Early settlers had large land tracts granted by the Six Nations, but by 1830, the Six Nations had agreed finally to permit the government to transact future land grants. Land purchases before this time were confusing because Six Nations had granted tracts to their members and then later to settlers who they knew from the Mohawk River Valley. But over time, all or part of these tracts were being resold to newcomers, often without clear title defined. Settlers had to be a hardy bunch, building their own homes, making most of their tools and equipment, growing and harvesting their food, whether in the field or on the hoof, and making their own clothes, candles, and soap. In fact, almost everything they needed to survive. Trading with one's neighbors was the best way to enhance what you didn't have. Sugar, molasses, and tea were some of the few items that were imported and had to be purchased. In 1823, the area was described as covered largely in scrub oak, with dense virgin forest to the north and west, filled with deer and bear. To the east was a cedar swamp flowing through the village property where many cold water streams filled with trout. There was less than 100 residents at Grand River Swamp compared to York, now Toronto, which had about 1,600 people, and Hamilton, which was hardly shown on the map because Dundas and Ancaster were the major centers. The nearest post office was in Burford to the west, which was the main economic and military center for this territory, and Ancaster to the east. A post office would be established in 1825 using the name Grand River Ferry. Major individuals were William Kennedy Smith, who had a large tract west of Cedar, or what is now West Street, William D. Dutton, who purchased the western part of Chief David Hill's farm and had major lots in what would become the village. John A. Wilkes and his two sons, John Jr. and James, purchased the eastern part of the Hill farm and had major holdings in what would become part of the village. Plus, James Cockshut, with his son Ignatius and daughter Jane, would be significant individuals. By 1827, there were about 250 people at the village. By 1832, there were 350 people. Now would begin the major pressure to expand such that by 1837, there were 1,200 people, and by 1842, Brantford had surpassed 2,000 people. And by 1847, there were approximately 3,000, enough to form a town. The area already reflected a multicultural character with Indigenous people, relocated Americans, Black people of various origins, be they free loyalists, escaped slaves, or Caribbean immigrants, English, Scottish, German, and Irish, each in various numbers. The Irish Catholics were never well received and were always considered potentially disloyal. There had been a town plan drawn by Joseph Reed in 1824. By 1830, people had requested that the Commissioner of Crown Lands, Peter Robinson, to affirm title to the lots they occupied through Crown Charter, especially since some of the lots had changed hands several times. Lewis Burwell, local surveyor, was assigned, and he acknowledged the first map of Reed when he made his initial map of 1830 and his final map of 1833. The resulting map and survey showed the first surrender by the Six Nations of the Grand River for a town settlement and the various lot owners. Soon after Burwell completed his survey, a large influx of settlers arrived. An influx of escaped slaves from the United States caused some disorderliness. Residents held a meeting, signed a petition, and sent it to the government. The result being that the Black population was moved to other places. In Brantford, many moved out of the area, out of the town area to the future East Ward, while still others went to the Queen's Bush, north and west of present-day Waterloo. 1839 and 1840 produced extreme crop yields such that by 1841, with the encroachments of the likes of the Grand River Navigation Company, squatters in large portions of the Haldimand Tract, a lack of enforcement of territorial integrity by the government, and a lack of any financial reserves remaining in a trust fund which had been intended to safeguard their future, the Six Nations agreed to a significant surrender of lands and relocate onto a 644,000 acre reserve. They wanted to retain the Mohawk Village, the Mohawk Institute, and the Mohawk Chapel within the reserve, but settlers pressed for the site to be further downriver, southeast of Brantford. Farm folk. Think in terms of Mennonites and Amish, and you'll have a sense of what life was like for the newcomers, especially for those on the farm. The area had native farms all along the river, and settler farms came right to the edge of the village. 4 out of every 5 settlers to Upper Canada were farmers and were expected to be farmers, and all farmers were expected to be self-sufficient. So the earliest tasks were to get a shelter built and the first crop sown to ensure survival. There were significant expectations that came with a farm lot, typically 100 acres. Within 2 years, one must clear 10 acres of the lot fit for cultivation and fence. Build a house 16 by 20 feet of logs or frame with a shingle roof, who's also cut down all the timber in front of and the whole width of the lot, 33 feet of which must be cleared smooth and left to be half of the public road. These requirements were strictly enforced outside of the Haldimand Tract, but not so within. The first home was likely a tent or lean-to until a crude cabin was constructed. Normally, neighbors would help one another with constructing cabins and likely later homes too. Most settlers started with chickens and hogs as livestock, moving to buy sheep and goats for their wool and hides, and moving to cattle as soon as security would permit. Farmers would sell to the town folks wood for fuel, wood ash for fertilizer, and grain. The grains in this area were wheat and rye, since this would become the breadbasket for the colony, as well as flax for linen cloth. Six Nations grew corn and beans. Itinerant Presbyterian minister Reverend Proudfoot in 1832 described the countryside as follows: "Nothing can be duller and more cheerless than the aspect of Upper Canada. In every direction there are open spaces cut in the forest. These are farms of the settlers, but as every farmer leaves a portion of timber for firewood, the country is still that of a forest. In scarcely any place can you see 100 acres cleared of timber, and even in the cleared places, the stumps of the trees are in general still standing. When I first saw Upper Canada, I thought nothing could be more unsightly, but I have now got so accustomed to the stumps that I seldom heed them." It would take many years for a settler to clear his full 100-acre purchase, but he had good timber in the form of oak, maple, elm, chestnut, and white pine. The burned tree stumps would fertilize the fields. This is a typical cabin that you'd find in Oxford County, which did exist when the village was being established. And you can see that at Westfield Heritage Village. At 18 years of age, Alexander Tulloch Galt, a former father of Confederation, would arrive in Upper Canada, accompanying his father, John Galt, who became commissioner of the Canada Land Company, responsible for settling the Huron tract between Lakes Erie and the Huron. Young Alex Galt provided this summary of country life in a report to the company board of directors in London, England. "A settlement in the backwoods of Canada, however romantic and pleasing may be the accounts generally published, has nothing but stern reality and hardship connected with it. Alone in the woods in his log cabin with his family, tired from a day's work and knowing that the morrow brings but the same toil, the immigrant will find but few of the fancies realized for the first years. For the emigre to succeed, he must work as hard and suffer perhaps greater privations than had he remained in Great Britain. Women suffered terribly from the loneliness of pioneer farm life. John Van Patter, son of Prince Van Patter, a black slave of Joseph Brant, owned 50 acres near Colborne and Rawdon, where he built a 24 by 18 single-story house. He was a farmer, laborer, and a translator of Mohawk for the early settlers to the area. Villagers or townies? If you've seen a movie Western, then you have an idea what the frontier settlement of Brantford would have looked like when it was just a village. As the survey of the town site revealed, there was the expectation that the settlement would be modeled on an English village with a village square, a market square, burial grounds, places of worship, courthouse, jail, school, town hall, and poorhouse. Conditions in a settlement could be worse than those on the farm. Townies were much more likely to succumb to diseases, especially those caused by poor sanitation practices, since outhouses were often too close to water sources. Villagers seldom grew all of the crops they would need for the year, and they were often too busy at their employment to have the time needed to go into the forest for firewood, so they lacked self-sufficiency in both food and fuel. A great many jobs ended in early November. All public works and construction work were halted until the spring. For those who retained their jobs, wages often would be reduced by as much as half because of the number of available workers for the available jobs and the reduced work hours during winter months. In the winter months, the price of food and fuel would rise to match the scarcity. As winter wore on, as much as 20% of a person's wages would go to firewood. The price of bread from a bakery typically rose by approximately 50% in the winter months. In late spring, when food and fuel prices were the highest, this was known as the pinching season. It fit well with the Lenten fast. One might expect protests, but those in need seemed to be silent because of exhaustion, the bitter cold, and a strong respect for the law. Cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens roamed freely throughout the village until Brantford became a town in 1847. When it rained, streets were deep with mud, filth, and other leavings. Plank sidewalks ran along the side of the streets, but one obstacle was getting from one side of the street to the other through the muck and mire. Elizabeth Reed, the wife of the surveyor, Joseph Reed, despite her husband returning to Britain, she remained here and prospered. Women found town life much more agreeable than farm life, thanks to companionship. There was some work which was seen as acceptable for women, and many of those related to housekeeping, like seamstress and baker's assistant. But interestingly, being an ale housekeeper or taverner was acceptable because locations were often travelers' lodgings as well. And on the map, you'll notice that there are, if you follow Colburn Street along, there are two portions that look like ladders. Later, you'll notice that I will talk about those as we talk about travel, but what they are is not clearly understood. So there will be two options that are offered in the next section. Should I stay or should I go? Travel was largely by walking, horseback, or wagon. Then later, stagecoach. The service developed in the 1820s. What we know as Colburn Street was then Hamilton Road to the east and the Detroit Trail to the west. Colburn Street was the most popular thoroughfare since it went along a long-established route used for millennia as a native trail. With settlement by loyalists and military, it became the King's Highway. Governor's Road existed since the early 1800s, thanks to direction provided by Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, but few wanted to use it because of the steep hills at Nithsdale, later Paris. The fording place was believed to be an easy and cheap crossing point, and there was also a ferry and a bridge as alternatives for those who were willing to pay the toll. To the east of the village was a cedar swamp with Coldwater Stream, which required a corduroy road to be built to ensure a stable crossing. Corduroy road is log being laid across the road to provide some support, and then sand thrown on top to even out the space between the logs for a smoother ride than the name implies. 20 miles per day was the typical distance covered, and 30 miles in a day was considered big travel. Therefore, inns were located quite frequently for providing meals and changing horses during the day, while plus overnight accommodation, such as it was. Burford would be the next stop to the west, and Cainesville to the east, where in the 1830s, you could catch a ship to travel down the Grand River, likely to the Welland Canal or Buffalo. As previously mentioned, there was an inn on either side of the ford. A small log building was an inn at the corner of George and Colburn, and another wood frame building was an inn at Queen and Colburn. Later, some inns would also have residences to accommodate long-term renters. By the 1830s, there was a bridge that spanned the East Channel, which was the larger and faster part of the river, connected to an island on the west side of the river. There was also a smaller bridge to span the narrower West Channel. A covered bridge was built in 1841, and it lasted until 1854. As per Jean Waldy, by this time, there were also bridges existing near present-day Clarence to cross the stream in that swamp, as well as Wilkes Mill Race, and another at the stream near Rawdon Street. And those are the items that on the map look like ladders. She defines them as bridges, They could just as easily have been where the corduroy was. Presbyterian minister Reverend Proudfoot in late October 1832 reported that the drive from Hamilton to Brantford, approximately 20 miles, took 7 hours over wretched roads. After having been in London, Upper Canada, the Reverend returned to this village on November the 22nd and recorded. Arrived at Brantford by covered wagon at 2:30 in the morning. Every bed in the tavern was full. There was no wood chopped. We were compelled to go out and chop wood, make a fire in the bar room, and sit there weary and hungry and sleepless till the folks got up. Did all we could to raise servants to get us some tea, but not one would move. The worst usage, meaning retreatment, the worst usage I ever met with in all my journeyings took 21 hours to go 50 miles. A house is more than a home. Sorry, a house is more than a house. Consider H. Crandon built a house that still stood in 1900 and seemed to be typical of early house construction. Most houses were constructed of logs or rough-hewn timber. The Crandon house was little different. Like many homes in the village, people tried to build using the slope of the hill so that one easily entered on the main floor, but the floor below would also have windows for light. The cut into the slope also meant easy excavating for a cellar, and a root cellar could be designed as part of the lower level. There was not a brick in the entire Crandon house. Tree trunks formed the main structure, thickly placed, supporting beams, and stringers, which were the horizontal members, rested on wooden posts, served to create a most substantial house which withstood the ravages of time for more than 70 years. On the main floor was a major parlor and a back parlor as well, each having a fireplace for heat built to take sizable logs. There was a preparation kitchen with a little bedroom opening off of it, and at the back was a preparation kitchen that led also to a summer kitchen with a wood house on the back of the main house. The kitchen would have had a fireplace with crane and trammel to hold large pots and kettles. Most of the meals would be one-pot meals like porridge, stews, and soups, or Dutch oven for roasting. On the second floor, there were 3 bedrooms plus a side room. Below the main floor were 2 cellars. In one was a large fireplace for cooking, and in the other, the remains of a large bake oven and a cistern as well. One would also expect to find the root cellar built into the hillside, which would be easily accessible to the baking kitchen. Like most homes, the lowest floor was a tramped earthen floor that would later be replaced with a plank floor as finances permitted. Much of the house, but especially the kitchens, would be white or lime washed to brighten and sanitize the space. This would apply to privies and some barns as well, especially dairy barns. Back in Britain, during this period, few people would have had time to bake their own bread. A grist mill for flour, a brewery for yeast, and a bakery were a common trio in most British villages. In Upper Canada, this village had a grist mill and a brewery, but most bread was baked in each home, thus the reason for the large bake oven in the cellar. By 1830, however, there was a baker in Brantford, Joseph Markwell, meaning more people were relying on his services. Working for a living. In 1823, there was a small log building that was an inn at the corner of King and Colburn, and another wood frame at Queen and Colburn. There were no buildings on the south side of Colburn between these 2 inns. Below on Water Street were several springs and the resulting cold water streams. Opposite the tavern at Queen and Colburn, there was a small frame store and a deserted log hut. There was a blacksmith shop on the brow of the hill and a thin scattering of frame and log houses along Colburn Street. In 1823, there were 3 small general stores operated by John A. Wilkes, who arrived here in 1820, Stephen V.R. Douglas, and the third, Nathan Gage, with whiskey being one of the chief items of trade for all 3. There were 2 boot shops operated by William D. Dutton and Aruna Huntington, and Huntington also sold tea and other commodities, and a blacksmith shop operated by William Qua. Trade was done mainly with the local natives and recent settlers. The Wilkes operation was handled by sons John Jr. and James. James was just 15 when he arrived here, while his father, John Ashton Wilkes Sr., ran a business in Toronto, or York at the time. The elder Wilkes purchased considerable property in this area. The business was in a frame building on the north side of Colburn Street between the 2 taverns. Later, the business moved closer to Market Square and would move later still across from the Market Square. There was a competing store run by the Wilson brothers, Benjamin and Matthias, and Benjamin also operated as a distillery. Most business was transacted on a trade and barter system, and most general stores had a cold cellar to store butter and eggs for resale. Currency was not standardized, and the currencies of the United States and Spain were used. Most currency that circulated was not legal tender and was outlawed by the government, such as it was at the time. Tiffin token is an example of a currency that was purchased by created by a grocer in Montreal in 1830. That was a brass copy of an earlier version of the British penny and halfpenny, which should have been copper if it was true currency. In the 1830s, there were 3 mills. Jedediah Johnson's grist mill, built in 1823 by Marshall Lewis and purchased in 1828 at Mill Street at the foot of Queen Street on the mill race that would later become part of the canal. Asahel Hubbard sawmill since 1824, with the race running away from the ford into present-day Eagle Place. And the John A. Wilkes grist mill at Colburn and Clarence on the stream we now call Shallow Creek. By 1830, John A. Wilkes owned 2 other shops offering merchandise, plus a saddler's shop, a storehouse, 2 barns, a mill, and a distillery. William D. Dutton also prospered, owning a tavern, shoemaker's shop, barn, and storage shed. Rufus Houghton operated a sizable tannery on Northumberland Road, now East Avenue, that included a 34 by 20 workshop, a bark house to color hides, oak bark was best, and 11 tanning vats, with his family living in a 1-story 22 by 18 frame house nearby. William Richardson owned a merchant store, Richardson and Kirkpatrick, a small stable, and a large granary, 30 by 16, and lived in a 30 by 24 frame house. He was the first postmaster serving from 1825 to 1841, and he commanded the local Brantford militia. Blacksmith John Boylston, who was black, was part of the community, with many of the black citizens living in houses near Dalhousie and Cedar, now West Street, roughly the site of the area where the Bell Memorial is today. In 1831, William Kirby built another distillery where the Kirby Mill would later stand by the river near Grand River Street. In 1832, William Spencer constructed a brewery on the later site of the YMCA Wycliffe Hall. Winter of 1835-36, fire struck and burned a significant portion of the village, and the community needed to rebuild quickly before it lost commerce to Cainesville, now on the canal, or to Paris. Work on the Brantford cut of the Grand River Navigation Company began in 1843 and opened 5 years later on November the 7th, 1848. The first truly large hotel was built in 1846 at Colburn and Peel Streets. A change is as good as a rest. There was little recreation time and entertainment was very local. The recreation that was what recreation there was, usually consisted of drinking, since ale was consumed with a meal. Recreational time usually involved distilled liquor, such as rye whiskey. In the tavern, the recreation usually involved gambling, either at cards or dice. For farming folk, social contact was limited mainly to two opportunities: the weekly observance of the Sabbath, to visit, exchange news, and share advice, and the work bees, be they for raising a barn or a house, for clearing stumps, for harvesting crops, or later for creating those fancy finishes like quilts and other stitchery. A bee had a carnival atmosphere as men worked together, women prepared refreshments, and children played with newfound friends. A plowing match was a popular event among farming folk. Any town gatherings were usually a political meeting, religious service, or funeral or wake, with the occasional kitchen ceilidh or house party if someone could find the time and space to host. The yearly calendar would evolve something like the following: May Day to celebrate the spring and the arrival of spring tasks, Midsummer to herald summer and the related summer tasks. August was the transition to major fall harvest. Guy Fawkes Day, or Bonfire Night, was the end of the harvest season, but it began the culling of the livestock for winter preservation. A harvest celebration giving thanks usually took place around this time in church. Advent to finalize tasks to prepare for the period of break that Christmas and New Year's would permit. Christmastide is the holiday time with limited chores. The social season was that portion between Epiphany and Ash Wednesday, with limited chores, and the ease of travel on snow and ice meant more social interchange. Lent was the period of scarcity, with the focus on emerging spring tasks, such as maple syrup sugaring off, and providing equipment or preparing equipment for a year of labor. Eastertide was a deeply religious focus, but also a time of birthing, with eggs, rabbits, and lamb being common food, along with ham as a backup. Although each cabin, however small, had its own fireplace, Christmas Eve would have had no row of empty stockings attached. Christmas was often a day of nostalgia for remembrance of family and friends in the homeland. Early settlers passed Christmas much as they would an ordinary day, doing household chores. The menu for a Christmas meal would have been much more the same as for any other day. One family might serve pigeon and another partridge. Squirrel too was common, or pork might have formed the meat course. Presbyterian minister Reverend Proudfoot recorded, "There was scarcely an open shop. Many go to church. The Roman Catholics and the Episcopalians," that's Anglicans, "and the Presbyterians had service together," close quote. It should be realized that carols were for the street, not for the church. In 1838, there was the coronation of Queen Victoria. William Buck, who was just 8 years old at the time, reported when he was 68 years of age that, quote, the announcement of a celebration caused great excitement, and when the auspicious night arrived, everyone in the district was on hand. The principal feature was an immense bonfire in front of Lovejoy's Hotel, that was at King and Colburn Street. Another indulgence was the use of fireballs. These were balls of pitch and other combustibles, which were lighted and tossed about by the men. The art of catching them in the bare hands and throwing them back was one which was highly esteemed. Doubtless other exercises took place, but I'm not in a position to speak of them accurately, considering the passage of time. The coronation bonfire was a remarkable success and was long remembered by the youth, close quote. The 3 R's. In 1836, the first schoolhouse was a building on Market Square. It started as a log structure and later was a 2-story frame structure which had a bell on the roof, which was rung for fires and for whenever someone died. It would be the village school until about 1850, when Central School was built. The building also served as the village hall, courthouse, public meeting house, entertainment center, and church for several fledgling congregations. School was for boys mostly, and usually only those who could pay, since there was no public schooling. Thomas A. Potts reports, quote, my grandfather, Thomas Potts, and his friend went with me one day down George Street to the Market Square. They pointed out the spot where the old town pump drew water from the spring. On the site where the sidewalk now is, once stood a log schoolhouse and meeting house. This was known as Mullen Hill, and by the way, I put that plant in the corner here so you know what I'm talking about, named after the plants growing there. This hill was later cut down and became the site of the town hall. My grandfather told me that his father, Joseph Potts, taught in this, the first school in Brantford. My grandfather and his brother and sisters attended school there. Along Colburn Street, from George to Market, were squatters' shacks. They caught fire and burned down, taking the school and hall with them, close quote. Aruna Huntington was typical of most craftsperson in that his 2 sons were expected to work at the cobbler's bench during school holidays and after school each day. The earliest educational resource in the community was the Mechanics Institute, established in the early 1830s, but it closed in 1837. Had it become a hotbed for the rebellion? And it didn't reopen until several decades later. The first print news source was the Upper Canada Gazette, published in Newark, now Niagara-on-the-Lake, by the King's printer, first published in on April 18, 1793. It would later move with the government to York, Toronto. It would have the up-to-date news about Upper Canada and the decisions of the Lieutenant Governor and his advisory council and the legislature, which consisted of the Legislative Council and Assembly. On the scene in 1823 was the Weekly Register, and like all newspapers, it was a weekly that would rely on newspapers from other sources, such that most of the news from Britain and the United States was as much as 6 weeks old. The first newspaper published in Brantford was the Brantford Sentinel in 1833, launched by David Keeler. In 1834, Keeler married, and his wife Alice worked at the newspaper, becoming the first female journalist in Canada. In 1837, Keeler, as an active reformer, would need to flee to the United States because of the failed rebellion. Now Alice would become the first female newspaper owner-operator with responsibility for hiring a new editor and journalists. Later, her father, Thomas Lemon, would take over the newspaper and rename it the Brantford Courier and Grand River Commercial Advertiser. The Brantford Herald was begun by Wellesley Johnson in 1840 as a voice of reformers, and it would last for 20 years. That same year, the Tribune was launched by J. Steele, and it became the mouthpiece of the Clear Grits, who had separated from the reformers to form their own political party. When a newspaper was published, friends and neighbors would gather to read and discuss the content in any number of locations, be they the general store, the barber shop, or outside church. Which side are you on? Men of property were the only people who had the right to vote, but most settlers were landowners, therefore almost every male adult settler got to vote. Most politics was local and related chiefly to the material necessities of settler life. Voting took place over 2 or more days. Each voter cast his vote in a manly way, meaning he shouted out his choice and took the consequences from all those who heard him. Government was clearly less involved in daily life than it was in Britain or the United States. Government funding was limited to taxes, which were almost exclusively obtained through customs and excise duties or tariffs on goods that crossed a border. The limited funds available to colonial governments forced them to focus on law and order issues, such as defense, resulting in maintaining a local militia, which also handled limited policing duties, and courts and jails for meting out punishments. Landowners were responsible for the road that touched their property, and the government enforced that requirement, even though clergy reserves and crown lands didn't have to establish or maintain a road. In fact, local landowners were dragooned into ensuring a road was maintained across those empty land tracts, which amounted to 2 out of every 7 lots. The first village council meeting took place in 1833, with almost all the meetings being held at Bradley's Inn at the corner of Colborne and King Street. Jean Waldy wrote, quote, "Many bitter enmities arose at the time of the rebellion of 1837 and existed long after the political troubles were ironed out. Most of the residents of the village of Brantford and surrounding district were known as either loyalists or rebels. The local leader of the rebels, her word, William Matthews, assembled at the village of Scotland with the intent of marching on Brantford and proceeding to Hamilton. He fled to the United States, where he remained for 2 years until finally he was pardoned. William Richardson was a captain of the 1st Boer Regiment in 1827. Following the Mackenzie uprising in December of 1837, Richardson was sent to the village of Scotland by Colonel Allan Napier McNabb to report on the status of the rebels intending to assemble there. Matthias Wilson served as a captain of the 10th Gore Cavalry Troop during the rebellion of 1837 to 39, and James A. Wilkes Jr., at 30 years of age, was commissioned as an ensign in May of 1837 in the 1st Gore Regiment, and he led a company of the Brantford Light Infantry for 6 months during the rebellion. J.J. Hawkins, one of the pioneers to the area, recalled that hostility was still in evidence in 1849 when the Governor General, Lord Elgin, while touring Upper Canada, was driven from Simcoe to Brantford, guarded by a large escort of reformers of the district, because he had been attacked by ultra-royal mobs in different parts of the country, and threats had been rumored in Brantford and vicinity, all resulting from the upset over the passing of the Rebellion Losses Bill earlier that year. J.J. Hawkins also reported the digging of the canal and other work connected with the Grand River Navigation Company brought several rough characters to the settlement. He on many occasions witnessed battles with clubs and axe handles on the market square and especially at election meetings. The first bylaw enacted by the new town council on September 15, 1847, was to prevent horses and swine from running at large at any time and to prevent cattle from running at large between December the 1st and May the 1st. The penalty for an infraction was a fine of up to 20 shillings plus the fees for impounding the animals. This would have been the first act which would have contravened the expectations of the indigenous people that land should remain hunting grounds where animals should roam freely. Old approaches for new. In 1844, Brantford's manufacturing history was about to change, and it started at Queen and Dalhousie Streets. For millennia, humankind had made its achievements through human energy, or by harnessing some animals, or by using the energy of water, wind, or wood. A new energy source was about to make its arrival. P.C. Van Brocklin, immigrated from the United States and established a foundry at Queen and Dalhousie Streets. It began as a one-horse operation because in the basement there was a workhorse harnessed to a drive wheel to drive the gear arrangement which powered the machinery in the foundry operation above. The foundry was making cast iron steam engines, which would in short order replace that one horsepower operation and change the entire industrial makeup of Brantford, eventually moving this village towards becoming a major manufacturing center built around the steam engine. 4 years later, in 1848, the operation was acquired by the operation acquired an active associate in C.H. Watrous, and the foundry became Watrous Engine Works. This foundry would expand into producing many steam-powered pieces of equipment, making the country an extremely attractive investment. It would later become Coring Watrous, which would in 1988 be purchased by Timberjack of Woodstock and ultimately be purchased by John Deere in 2006, which meant this operation was in Brantford for more than 160 years. Food. Many of the inns on Colburn Street owned a lot on Dalhousie Street. The lot on Dalhousie was usually left undeveloped to become the stable and the garden plot for vegetables, and many had an orchard to grow fruit, all for the tavern kitchen. The settlers had brought with them many of the fruits and vegetables with which they were familiar, such as asparagus, carrots, turnip, parsnip, cabbage, cauliflower, which could be stored in cold cellars well into the winter, plus peas and currants, which were dried for storage, as well as rhubarb, which was eaten when it was fresh each spring. The settlers learned from the indigenous people about potatoes, sweet potatoes, squash, and maple syrup, which could be stored for the year, as well as beans, corn, and sunflower seeds, which could be dried, along with pumpkin, wild berries were usually turned into baked goods. The berries also could have been turned into preserves. One of the plants that you may not know the settlers brought was dandelion, because they were familiar with using the entire plant. Apple, pear, cherry, and plum trees were planted as soon as a settler could arrange, so that there would be an alternate fruit to the local berries. And I've listed honey here because while there were honeybees in North America, the European honeybee was the main source of large quantities of honey. And that was the honeybee that they tended to rely on. The settlers learned from the indigenous people the crops that could be harvested from the wilderness, like onion, wild rice, plant roots like Jerusalem artichokes, wild herbs used for both seasoning and medicines, as well as nuts from oak, walnut, butternut, hazel, chestnut, and hickory. George Hansfield related a story that he'd heard from his grandparents, which stated that, quote, if anyone wished to have a few meals of quail on toast, all that was necessary was for him to take his flintlock, a grain bag, and walk along the slope below what is now Brant Avenue, Dufferin Avenue, and Lansdowne Park, and in less than half an hour, he could have that grain bag nearly half full of quail, which were as numerous as flies, close quote. Other birds that were hunted were turkey, grouse, duck, goose, passenger pigeon, snipe, a sandpiper, and yellowlegs, a marsh piper. Not a whole lot different from today, hunting and trapping were common activities for obtaining meat and furs, but the game was much closer. And the game consisted of such things as deer, raccoon, and squirrel, which I've capitalized because they were the main food sources that they came to rely on. Black bear, groundhog, beaver, and hare. Fishing was great because depending upon how and when it was done, it might result in some downtime. As one fished for trout, sturgeon, smallmouth bass, pickerel, perch, and salmon. The typical meal was largely salted pork, though it could also be smoked to become ham. And when a cow or an ox was no longer of value to the farm, then beef. Seldom was horse eaten. Rabbits, sheep, and goats were raised for their wool and later their meat and hides. Chicken was seldom eaten because the eggs were so valuable, but even they had their end. Itinerant Presbyterian minister Reverend Proudfoot wrote in a letter to his daughter back in Scotland in the winter of 1832, quote, the children breakfast on fried ham and potatoes and tea and bread, and they like it far better than porridge. Dinner is at 1 o'clock and tea at 6. All meals are the same. There is no supper in this country. This is the fare in the very poorest log homes I have seen. In the better families, there's pickled beet, pickled cucumber, preserved plums and peaches, and apple pie. And in season, applesauce is eaten to all butcher meats. Dinner was the same at 6 o'clock. There you see the Canadians live well, and many who live thus every day tell me that they scarcely ever saw butcher meat in the old country and had difficulty in getting porridge and potatoes. On the 7th day, he rested. Before there were resident ministers, the local people often performed marriages themselves and had them affirmed when the itinerant preacher came through. Churches were the main source of charity, and in some areas, the source of education as well. The unemployed were considered idle poor, no matter what their predicament. John Waterhouse was a farmer who occupied part of a block between Dalhousie and Darling Streets. He had 2 log houses and a barn. He also had 50 acres under lease from John Van Patter, the black laborer in East Ward. Waterhouse was disabled, but he had a large family with a wife, 6 children, and 3 grandchildren, who were able to provide him the support he required. The Anglicans were well established in the community, and settlers joined the local Indigenous people at the Mohawk Chapel, which was built between 1782 and 86. The chapel would get its first permanent minister in 1828. As evidenced by marriage certificates, there was a village congregation by 1830, and they built Grace Church, first a white frame church on Cedar Street, now West Street, which opened in 1832. The Baptists, Presbyterians, and Ingamites Wesleyan Methodists and Congregationists all tended to gather as one at the schoolhouse for Sunday services until their numbers were large enough to form a separate congregation. If they believed they needed a separate service, then the members concerned often gathered by the river during good weather. The Inghamites were the first to form a separate congregation in 1833 and met at the home of Miles Coleman while their church was built. Farringdon Church opened in 1839. The Baptists formed their congregation of 26 members on December the 23rd, 1833. They opened their white frame First Baptist Church on Cedar Street opposite Chatham Street in 1834. The British Wesleyan Methodist Church opened on September 19, 1835 on the corner of Market and Darling Streets, where the TD Canada Trust is today, consisting of a chapel and a parsonage. The congregation had purchased a lot on Wellington Street, today is the city parking lot, for a large church, and that became a necessity in 1853 when their first church burned. The Congregationalists chose to meet in a second floor of John A. Wilkes' warehouse, beginning in 1836. They built a white frame church on the north side of Lucy Street and opened its doors in 1835. It burned in 1864. The Presbyterians held separate services at the schoolhouse beginning in 1834, and in 1845, the congregation purchased the lot at the corner of Wellington and George Street, the site of what would become the 1967 City Hall site, and built their first church. With the arrival of many Irish laborers for building the canal, the village had a large enough Roman Catholic population to build their first church on Crown Street in 1840. It was also a white frame construction and named St. Basil's. Many churches, like the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, were already the source for activist organizations like the Emancipation Society and as well as the Temperance Society. To your health. Settlers had few medical sources to call upon. Pioneer women administered herbal remedies to their families and provided care, acting as nurses and midwives for family and friends. Anyone, male or female, with a knowledge of herbs and medicines was considered a doctor, and that was the case with Eliza Good of Myrtleville and Alan Ellis, who has been described as the first doctor of Mount Pleasant. Sanitation was through primitive privy pits. In winter, workers would clear these pit toilets and carry the night soil onto the river ice to be carried away with the spring runoff. The excavations of Colburn Street has revealed wooden pipes for draining water away from buildings. The first professional doctor and surgeon in Brantford was Dr. John S. Thomas, who is believed to have arrived around 1829. In 1832, Dr. Gilpin put out his shingle. In 1835, Dr. Alfred Digby opened his practice, which began a family of doctors in Brantford. Two other doctors are known to have advertised in the Courier newspaper in the early 1840s, Dr. Thomas Lightbody and Dr. Skinner, 5 doctors whose talents would be needed. In 1828, before there was a doctor here, there was an epidemic of typhoid fever, which was an infectious fever characterized by intestinal disturbance, eruptions of rose red spots on the chest and abdomen, and one being unable to stand. We know now that fever results from bacteria contaminated by water, milk, and food. In 1832, there was an epidemic of cholera, which is an infectious disease characterized by intestinal distress and often fatal diarrhea leading to dehydration resulting from bacteria contaminating water or food. With no facilities for coping with such a crisis, it is reported that the village leaders took over a shed at the bottom of Church Street that could be used to keep, that had been used to keep wagons and implements over the winter. This is not the particular shed that's shown here, but this is a barn that came from Brant County, and also is at Westfield Heritage Site. George H. Broomfield, the first curator of the Brant Historical Society, reported that a lady, name not recorded, volunteered to nurse the victims brought in by the wagon load. A bonfire burned day and night over which steamed a cauldron of beef broth. That and whiskey made up the medicine given to the sick, who were placed on a cold plank floor, still in their clothes. There were no blankets. The broth was brought in pails and fed to the patients using tin dippers. It was cold, ugly, and terrible, but the lady did what she could, cooling hot foreheads, calming the delirious, and speaking words of comfort to the bereaved. It seemed to have no positive effect for the sick, but thanks to this improvised aid station, no one of the villagers contracted cholera. One tragic aftermath of this epidemic was the near extinction of the Totello Indians, who had accompanied the Haudenosaunee to the Grand River and occupied the Totello Heights and surrounding lands. In 1847-48, there was another terrible epidemic, this time of ship's fever, or typhus. Sounds very much like typhoid because the symptoms were so similar. There was a mass migration of people to Britain and North America resulting from the devastating Irish potato famine in 1846-49. Typhus results from bacteria carried by body lice and fleas. If an immigrant was not showing signs upon landing in Quebec City, then he or she could move west to points like Toronto, Hamilton, Brantford, Woodstock, and London. Unfortunately, the disease could and did surface as people traveled west. As they came down with symptoms, they were warehoused in fever sheds. Later it was learned that concentrating people in neighborhood slums, ships' holds, and fever sheds all helped the disease to spread. People learned much too late that a good warm bath, clean clothes, and semi-isolation could stop the spread of the lice and fleas and therefore stop the disease. In 1849, cholera returned to Upper Canada, and this time it became the catalyst for some public health actions to try to improve sanitary conditions, like separating privies some distance from sources of drinking water. So why is this history important? Well, there's hope that this provides a picture of the early settlement from 1807 to 1847, before Brantford became a town. You may recognize some of the families that established this community and went on to build this community to become a significant city. The description should give you a sense of just how difficult life was for the earliest settlers. But Brantford had many of the elements for success, and the early settlers were working to add many new enterprises to make future success possible. During the earliest years, settlers worked with and relied upon the knowledge and resources of the indigenous people. But during the 1830s, things changed. And by the 1840s, white settlers were distancing themselves from black settlers and wanted to put as many miles between themselves and the indigenous people. This change warrants further investigation and understanding because it leads to many of the challenges we face almost 2 centuries later. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest.